Good evening, everyone. If you'd like to take a seat, and we're going to go ahead and get started here. There was a little bit of technology issues there that we were dealing with. So, good evening. Welcome to Keene State College. I am the Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs. My name is Dr. James Beebe, and it's my honor to just give a very brief institutional welcome and say thank you for coming out on a cold night. It could be, I guess it could be colder, it could be snowier, but we're glad you're here. This is a really important conversation the campus hosts, and we're excited to get started. So I just want to introduce Kate DeConnick to you, the director of the Cohen Center here. Kate's been doing amazing work. I think one of the amazing things that you've done is to bring these sort of conversations up so that folks can really engage with one another. So I'm very excited to hear what you have to say. Keene State is very supportive, as you know, of these sorts of issues coming to the fore, particularly right now, with the challenges that we face in the world around us. So I really think these sorts of conversations are really critical to the public liberal arts mission that we have, and good to see some folks from the community here and some of our students. So without further ado, Kate, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, James. Wonderful. Well, thank all of you for joining us today for this Cohen Conversation. Again, my name is Kate DeConnick, and I just wanted to start actually by thanking Michelle Kiawa from our team at the Cohen Center, who arranged all the lovely food that was out front for you and reserved this room and really did all the logistics that brought this event to life. So thank you, Michelle. And today we have the opportunity to engage with our speaker, Milt Zweig, who will be offering his presentation for about, well, I thought 25 minutes, but I'm hearing it might be a little longer than that, which is fine. So Milt's going to speak for a little bit as some presentation material to begin with. And then after that, he's going to field a few questions from Rodney Obian, who's our college archivist and one of our associate professors here at Keene State College. And then after that, we'll have some time for engagement together as a group. So I think we'll have a chance for you to kind of come up and look at some of the artifacts and the objects that Milt has brought with him to ask questions. So we did want to keep the last part of today's session a little bit more interactive so that it's not just lecture for the entire time. So if you do have questions for Milt, please save those for the kind of end when we have that interactive piece. I did also just want to mention, you noticed us doing some tech stuff at the start. We are recording today's event, so I just want to let you all know about that. So let me just say a few brief words to introduce Milt, and then I'm going to turn it right over to him so we can get into our presentation and conversation. But I met Milt in the fall of 2022, so almost a year and a half ago, we'll say, when we both joined the Jewish Federation of New Hampshire's Holocaust Survivors and Remembrance Committee right around the same time. And we had also both recently relocated to New Hampshire from California. So we were kind of talking about some of the changes that had been brought about in our lives as a result of that. But as soon as I got to know Milt a little bit better, I was really eager to connect him with our community here at Keene State College. And I think today's conversation is going to give you a sense of why I felt that way. As you'll hear today in Milt's conversation and in his presentation, more than 25 of his relatives were directly affected by the Holocaust in all different forms, right? So through imprisonment, exile, slave labor, being sent to gas chambers, and more. And what is so impressive, I think, about Milt is that he has dedicated so much time, countless hours, to researching his family history and tracing out that history over time. So along the way, he's collected some really impressive and important documents that have helped him piece some of this together, and other artifacts, some of which we'll get to look at with him today. And I know that some of the people in our audience tonight are actually going through or have gone through similar journeys in terms of figuring out how to trace these family histories. So I think we really have some rich fodder for conversation tonight as well. So the broad focus of Milt's presentation is Jewish life in Germany before the Third Reich took hold, and then also thinking about how they became swept up in this wave of destructive anti-Semitism over time. But I know that his family's personal stories are also going to be really central to what he's presenting today. So with that, let me turn the mic over to Milt and let's give him a hand. Thank you for being with us, Keene.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? So each and every one of these photos that you just saw are from the period about 1890 to about 1955, 56. And each one has one of my relatives in there that you saw. How do we get the slideshow here?
You just have to hit your start. Here you go.
Should that line stay on top there the whole time?
I think we can move that. So it's not distracting.
Okay, very good. There's a commemoration held every year, usually in the month of May, called Yom HaShoah, or Holocaust Remembrance Day. The first time this day was marked was in December 1949, when it coincided with the Hebrew calendar date of the 10th of Tevet, the fasting holiday marking the destruction of the first Jewish temple, or the Solomon Temple, which led to the Babylonian exile of the Jewish people. The chief rabbis of Israel recognized the solemn nature of this day and appropriately chose it to mark the Holocaust. 2 years later, the newly formed Israeli Knesset deliberated on what the official day should be for Yom HaShoah and ultimately decided on the 27th of Nisan, 1 week after the Passover holiday and 1 week before Independence Day. It's also the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The date was officially set into Israeli law in 1959. Among various activities, the law also established that there would be a 2-minute nationwide siren at 10 a.m., during which the whole country stops what they're doing and stand in silence for the duration. Having seen this in person twice, I can tell you it's a very moving experience. The date for Yom HaShoah this year is May 6th, and it's encouraged on this day to have educational programs or talks which feature those that were affected directly by the Holocaust. They may have been imprisoned in a camp or had a number tattooed on their arm, or been in hiding with the aid of a heroic non-Jewish person that put their own lives in danger, or perhaps left Europe and sought refuge somewhere. Sadly, most of these victims are gone. And now we have the children and grandchildren attempting to keep their stories alive by telling and retelling them through talks like this, or video documentaries, document movies, or books. What's even more sad is that the memories of people around the world seems to be disappearing as well. Just 10 months ago, a study titled "The Netherlands Holocaust Knowledge and Awareness Survey" was published by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. The study had some depressing findings. The number of Dutch adults who believe the Holocaust is a myth was higher than any country previously surveyed. 12% of all respondents believe the Holocaust is a myth, or the number of Jews killed had been greatly exaggerated, while 9% are unsure. These numbers are higher among Dutch millennials and Generation Z, those under age 40, where nearly 1/4 believe the Holocaust is a myth, or the number of Jews killed had been greatly exaggerated, while 12% are unsure. Even more alarming, a staggering 54% of Dutch adults did not know that the Holocaust spilled over their borders to their country, even though Anne Frank and her family was hiding amongst their buildings. This number increased to 60% with millennials and Generation Z kids. Crazy numbers. The president of the claims conference, Gideon Taylor, said survey after survey, we continue to witness a decline in Holocaust knowledge and awareness. Equally disturbing is a trend towards Holocaust denial and distortion. It's been close to 80 years now since the end of the Holocaust, and as we shift from survivor testimonies and memories to Holocaust lessons, it's even more important than ever to hear the stories that in some way or another shaped us in some distinct way. Although Yom HaShoah is still a few months off, I'm honored that the director of the Cohen Center, Dr. DeConnick, invited me as part of the Cohen Conversations, which reiterates the mission statement of the center's founder, Dr. Charles Hildenbrand, to remember and to teach. My story is not any better or worse than the millions of similar stories, but it's the story of my family and what happened to them. I'm not an expert on the Holocaust or on World War II. I only know from what I learned from my 60 years of living in a family that endured these experiences. I guarantee that there are some here in person or watching on video that know much more about the subject than I do. So I apologize ahead of time if I make a mistake in fact or some other context in the era. My name is Milt Zweig, and here's my story. But first, a couple of things. One, a good number of the photos you see are my own. These are photos in which I either have the original or have taken the actual picture myself. You can identify these as the ones with the date or information in red. All the others were swiped off the internet. Two, there are some graphic images. I can't sugarcoat the Holocaust, and I won't. But keep in mind that there are many other photos that are much worse and shocking than what I will show. Excuse me. I can trace my family back about 230 years to the 1790s. The digital age has made genealogy much easier than in years past, and sites like Ancestry.com and MyHeritage.com have made the search for relatives very eye-opening. More about this later. My ancestors lived mostly in the Pomerania region of Prussia, where the circle is there, along the Baltic Sea, which is present-day Poland, and were traders for leather and for bags and shoes. Eventually, many settled in the much larger and cosmopolitan city of Berlin, located 2 to 3 hours by car towards the west, presumably for work. I don't know how long that trip took. I'm sure it was much longer than 2 to 3 hours back then. Berlin was arguably the capital of Europe and became a very desirable area to live for both Jewish and non-Jewish people. The Jewish people were deeply ingrained in the society and enjoyed all the comforts of being citizens like everybody else. They were prominent and contributed greatly on all levels of society: government, doctors, laborers, teachers, and military. An example being my grandfather, who served for the Germans during World War I. These are my parents, Arnold and Uschi. She went by the name of Lanny. They were both born in Berlin about 6 years apart. My dad in 1924, my mom in 1930. Between the two of them, I'm able to identify about 25 direct relatives that were either impacted in some way during the Holocaust. There were also in-laws, uncles, aunts, cousins, and families that were involved, but I'm not going to include them here tonight. It's generally understood that the Holocaust started in 1933 with the appointment of Adolf Hitler as a German chancellor. The fact is, German anti-Semitism was brewing for many, many years before that, but in Germany, since the end of the First World War I in 1918, things became worse. Many falsely believed that the Jews were responsible for the German loss, even though many Jews were extremely loyal soldiers fighting for Germany. As I mentioned already, my family as well fought for Germany. Here are a few of the many photos that my grandfather sent to the family while stationed in various parts of Europe, where he diligently served and was eventually presented with the Eisernes Kreuz, or the Iron Cross Medal from Germany. And I had it on my desk at work, and I forgot to bring it here, but I have a picture of it here, so sorry about that. I'm going to start with my mother's side. My mother, as I said, was born in 1930 in Berlin, Germany. She was an only child, and her parents ran a relatively successful dry cleaning shop in Berlin. My mother had a pretty normal beginning of her childhood and was able to go to a Berlin public school. As a youngster, she was able to go on field trips. This photo was taken during her very first field trip in Berlin. You can kind of see her peeking her head through. They enjoyed a very modest life with frequent family gatherings with her favorite cousins, Erica and Rita, whose parents were helping in the day-to-day work at the dry cleaning shop. This is Herschel Greenspan. He was a 17-year-old German born to Polish Jews. He had fled to France in 1936. On October 26, 1938, his parents and 12,000 other Polish Jews living in Germany were detained, had all their possessions taken, and were sent to Poland on cattle cars. Herschel had learned that his parents were expelled from Germany and had endured inhumane treatment along the Polish-German border. Upset, he was able to purchase a gun in Paris, and on November 7th made his way to the German embassy, where he assassinated a low-level German embassy official, Ernst von Rath. Von Rath died 2 days later on November 9th, 1938, which was coincidentally the 15th anniversary of the Munich beer hall coup attempt by Hitler. Not missing an opportunity for inflammatory speeches, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, who was a chief instigator for Hitler, unleashed a speech which resulted in a torrent of violence against Jews that very same night. That night was called Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. My grandparents and mother had lived above the dry cleaning shop and received an anonymous tip that they should leave immediately or take the risk of being killed or harmed. Needless to say, they left. They fled to my great-grandmother's apartment across town and never saw their apartment or dry cleaning store again, as it was looted and destroyed. Now you can see why it was called the Night of Broken Glass. My mom was 1 week shy of her 8th birthday, and her life was upended. She was no longer allowed to go to school and was unable to see her friends or cousins, but she was safe at her grandma's apartment. Life became increasingly difficult and stressful. Eventually, the Jews were forbidden to be seen in public without their yellow star. When they were out, they had to walk in the gutters and not on the sidewalk where non-Jews were able to walk. The ever-present signs had extreme and often violent messages. These read Germans, defend yourselves, or do not buy from Jews, or Jews are unwanted here. Jewish schools were shut down. Eventually, all-out war spread throughout Europe, and they were stuck in Berlin. The Nazis would often bang on their door and had succeeded in taking most of their belongings, but they were never taken to a ghetto or camp. The building they stayed in had a cellar in which the Gentiles used for shelter during the constant aerial bombardment of Berlin. Since they were Jewish, they were forbidden from seeking safety in the cellar. They had to stay in their apartment and had to endure the bombings from that spot. Some of the bombs would fall silent before they exploded, leaving them terrified, wondering if one would hit their building. My mother's uncle, Uncle Bertold, was staying with them as well. He had one day found a way to be smuggled into Brussels, Belgium. It was already 1942 and extremely difficult to do anything except hide. Bertold made his way to Belgium and was able to send a note to the family in Berlin saying that he had acquired a place to live and that my mother and her family should find a way to get there. At that time, Jews were already required to register themselves with the local government, and Bertold was able to do just that on May 13th, 1942, just 2 days after his arrival. That very same day, he was also able to register with the Brussels immigration authorities and receive some sort of short-term visa that was common during that time. Meanwhile, back in Berlin, smugglers were arranged, and in late 1942, my almost 12-year-old mother, dressed like a Hitler Youth to not bring attention to herself, clutching a doll over her yellow star to hide it, boarded a train late at night with her mother, father, and grandmother to leave Berlin. They took one suitcase and some clothes and some jewelry they had successfully kept hidden previously. It was pitch black. They had no idea where they were going. After a while, the train stopped and they were herded off. A few lights off in the distance indicated where a safe house was, and a few cowbells in the distance indicated they were on a farm of some sort. Within a very short time, they had heard gunshots. Someone or a group of people were shooting at them, but it was so dark they probably couldn't see my mom and grandma. They dropped down to the manure-filled ground and waited. Eventually, a young man came by on a bicycle and offered to take my mom to the safe house. They made it and reunited a short time later. Much to their dismay, they quickly realized that their suitcases were emptied and replaced with bricks. They had nothing. Another wait, and they boarded another train, this time bound for Belgium. They arrived in Belgium and proceeded to the address provided by Uncle Bertold, only to be told of after arriving they had already been taken away by the Nazis. Nobody knew where he was taken until some 30 years later, when it was determined that he was taken to Auschwitz and murdered. A short sidetrack about Auschwitz. Auschwitz was actually 3 separate centers. The main concentration camp, located near the town of Auschwitz, Poland, was a converted Polish army barracks. The Nazis chose this particular spot because the convenient rail lines leading towards the entrance. It opened in 1940 and was ultimately the place where 1.1 million people were murdered. Auschwitz II, or Auschwitz-Birkenau, was about 2 miles from the main camp, and it was built in 1941. And finally, Auschwitz III, or Monowitz, was built in 1942. That was primarily used to house prisoners that worked at the nearby Buna synthetic rubber plant. Altogether, the Nazis established 23 main concentration camps with upwards of 900 subcamps. It's widely believed that these camps and other ghettos were responsible for the murder of 15 to 20 million people, of which 6 million were Jews. Back to Uncle Bertold. Further research done by myself in the last 10 years indicate that after Bertold arrived in May of 1942 and was subsequently arrested by the Sicherheitspolizei, or the SS, he was taken on September 4th to the transit camp known as Kaserne Dauphine. This camp was officially named General Dauphine de Saint Georges, and I apologize for my French. The barracks, built in 1756, and was strategically located between Brussels and Antwerp, an area that eventually became home to many Jews. Here's how it looks today, converted into apartments with a nice courtyard. The barracks were not very large, and it consisted of 3 buildings and a good-sized courtyard. It was mostly designed to hold a maximum of about 1,000 people. Eventually, as the Jewish people and Romas quickly filled the barracks, and as the population reached 1,000 or so, a trainload of detainees were taken to Auschwitz. This continued on from 1942 until the end of the war, with over 27,000 Jews and 350 gypsies sent to Auschwitz via 28 train convoys. As you can see by this copy I have of the Kaserne Dauphine Manifest, Bertold was assigned prisoner number 2098 and taken by train number 11, arriving to Auschwitz-Birkenau on September 26, 1942. Many of us have seen in movies or read in books of how the Nazis processed new arrivals to Auschwitz. It was actually a very simple, yet absolutely horrifying method. But imagine being stuffed into a train and arriving at some camp where hordes of prisoners are scrambling to hang on to their kids, seeing the large smokestacks of the crematorium, and smelling burning human flesh, and being yelled at by a German Gestapo to get in line quickly after taking off all your clothes and shoes. A German officer would be at the front of the line, and each person in line, one after the next, would be looked at and sent either to the left or right. The left was immediately to the gas chamber. The right meant you lived to see another day after having a number tattooed on your arm. For Uncle Bertold, he did not get a number and had an officer sternly pointing to the left, sending him immediately to the gas chamber. His transport held 1,742 people, and only 30 survived. My mother and her parents arrived in Brussels apparently one day prior to Bertold being arrested and were never able to reconnect with him. My mom and her parents were able to register also as required, and spent many hours trying to convince the authorities that they should be able to stay in the country. The Brussels police had established a special dossier on my grandfather, and he was questioned by the police repeatedly. Actually, they had regarded my family as illegal aliens, which they were. And I knew they had sent them, and knew that had they sent them back to Germany, they knew what would have happened to them. I obtained the complete dossier a few months ago. And after translating the documents in French and German, I was amazed at the amount of aggravation that they put the family through at that time. My grandparents wanted to put my mom, now about 13 years old, somewhere safe, so they arranged for a non-Jewish family to take care of her. They did, and my mom she actually changed her name to Janine, and I learned French and Flemish, which was spoken there as well. She tried to blend in as best she can. She went to a Catholic school and was able to keep a diary of sorts, which I have right here. There's not much in the diary except in English and French, her lessons that she had. She wrote a bunch of recipes in here. She wrote a message to a friend of hers named Helga. But it's very interesting to see how someone's old chemistry lab book became the prized possession of a young girl to use as a diary. My mom ended up speaking five languages during her life, but it was Flemish that we always wanted her to speak. Years later, living in California, she had no one at all that spoke Flemish. Nobody spoke it out there. And my siblings and I enjoyed when she spoke to us in Flemish, which was not very often. A few months after my grandparents and mother arrived to Belgium, my grandfather was captured by the Germans. He was on a Brussels train with a fake passport, but he left behind his yellow star. This one right here. He left it behind for reasons we'll never know. Perhaps he simply forgot it. Maybe he wanted to blend in as a non-Jew. Whatever the reason, a snitch hired by the SS had seen him and ratted him out. Like Bertolt, he was taken to Kaserne Docine and detained. My grandfather Arno was arrested and registered on October 9th, 1943 at the Mechlin transit camp and spent a little over 90 days there. While he was there, he was able to send a note to the family. This note right here. And it reads, "My dear family," he wrote in German, by the way. In translated, it says, "My dear family, I'm going to Malines. Don't worry, as it's only for a work assignment. Stay well, your booby." And in January, we were taken on transport 23 to Auschwitz-Birkenau, along with 659 others. Arno went through the line like Bertolt did, but the Gestapo officer pointed to the right, and Arno had a number tattooed on his arm, 172356. There were 346 men and boys on that particular transport, and only 140 survived the initial selection. I was able to determine that the tattooed numbers for those that made it through were 172296 and 172435. There's actually a way on the internet you can track down all the numbers that people had. My grandfather was in good shape. They sent him to Auschwitz III Monowitz, the one that was used for factory laborers. He ended up being a laborer for the IG Farben Company, which made synthetic rubber, and enslaved upwards of 80,000 prisoners during the duration of the war. This photo of the prisoners being marched to the IG Farben factory was given by a guard to one of the prisoners, and they were able to take that with them. After he arrived at Auschwitz, he was somehow able to get yet another note out to the family. The note was dated January 30th, only 16 days after he arrived. As my mother and grandmother were in hiding by this time, the note was sent to an acquaintance in Belgium who was eventually able to get it to my grandmother. Here's the note right here. The note reads, "My dear, I have arrived safely and healthy. I am well. Hope that you are healthy. The morale is good. Many heartfelt greetings from Arno Lehmann." Kind of interesting that someone who writes a note like that to his family, he puts his last name on there too. So he kind of tells you that it was kind of coerced to write that. But they were able to get a note. Unfortunately, it's the last time anyone had heard from my grandfather. And by March 28, he had become very ill, mostly due to exposure from the harsh chemicals in the factory. It was taken to the Auschwitz infirmary. On April 21, he was removed from the infirmary and taken to the gas chamber to likely make room for other sick prisoners. This is what an infirmary looked like in the camps. My mother and grandmother remained in hiding in Belgium for the duration of the war. They found refuge in the basement of a pub that was run by a lady named Suzanne Salins. She arranged for the basement to be as comfortable as possible, but the windows were covered and they were only allowed outside occasionally. This is not the actual place. That's just an example of what people were hiding in. On Sunday, September 3, 1944, just 5 months after my grandfather was killed, my grandmother and mother stood outside the flat that they were hiding in and watched as the British marched through Belgium, liberating the city and country, but not before enduring many sleepless nights praying that the Allied bombs didn't hit their flat. A few months ago, I traveled to Belgium to find out more about my family, and I made my way to a suburb of Brussels called Schaerbeek. This community is now a very pleasant, largely Muslim neighborhood with numerous restaurants, tea shops, and mosques. I was able to find some of the apartments that my family indicated where they were either living or hiding, but this one here was the most interesting. This is Avenue Roger, number 67. The same address in which my grandfather sent his first note, addressed to someone named Vogt. You can see on the left side there. He presumably knew where my presumably knew where my grandmother was. I looked in the windows when we were there and noticed it seemed abandoned. There was a bunch of junk in there, an old motorcycle, like a storage unit. But I did see a small light in the back. I hit the doorbell and waited. My wife yelled at me. She goes, "Don't hit the doorbell." But I waited. Eventually, someone came to the door, and just my luck, he didn't speak a lick of English or German, which I speak. I was relegated to Google Translate. And after apologizing, I wrote that my mom was hiding here during the war. I wrote it in French. He looked up and gave me a very uninspiring, "Oh." For whatever reason, I wrote, "Can we look around?" He looked up again and said, "No," and shut the door. So I looked at the name of the door right there, and I saw this name on here. It said Deconic.
What a small world. That's crazy.
And I was wondering, can this be a relative of Kate?
I hope not. I would have let you in, Milt.
That was pretty funny. We departed, hang on. We departed Brussels on a train to Cologne. Germany for a couple days. Along the way, I had an uneasy feeling. So I pulled out my phone to check something. This is actually a video I took outside the window of the train. And I confirmed my reason for my unsettled feeling. These were the exact rails that These were the exact rails that took the Mechelin detainees to the concentration camps. The train did not go 150 miles per hour like ours did. Didn't have a bar where I can get a beer. Didn't have nice windows to see the beautiful snowy countryside. Didn't even have a bathroom. The 2 to 3 day trips in these cattle cars were the preferred method of transportation. Packed full of people without seats, maybe a bucket instead of a bathroom, and totally unaware of their surroundings. That's outside the Kazir Dosin Museum as well. That's an actual car that they used. My mother had aunts and uncles as well. Her aunt Ella and her husband Elias and her 2 children, James and Rosa, had also lived in Berlin. James was 14, Rosa was 11 on January 12, 1943, when they were taken from a Berlin camp and placed on the 26th Ost transport or East transport with 1,188 others and shipped to Auschwitz. Actually, the whole family was packed into the train and sent to Auschwitz, dying together. I have not discovered any more information besides that. Some of you may notice something peculiar on this transportation list that included their names. Besides their names being misspelled, which I thought was odd, considering the Nazis were very detail-oriented. But the middle names, everyone had the same middle name. You notice that it says Israel or for the men or Sarah for the women. In 1938, the German Third Reich instituted a new law, the law of alteration of family and personal names. This law had forced Jewish men and women to add the names of Israel and Sarah to their names, thinking that this would be a good way to differentiate Jews from the non-Jews. Additionally, passports were stamped with a large red J for further anti-Semitic legislation. My grandfather had another sister named Herta. She had married Max, and they had two daughters, Rita and Erica, who I recall being my mother's favorite cousins, as her dad Max would often be at the dry cleaning shop helping out. Herta died from an unknown illness in 1935, and ironically is one of the few relatives of my family from that time period in which I can actually visit a real gravesite. Max and his two daughters made their way to Hamburg. I have no idea why. Oops, sorry. Max and his daughters made their way to Hamburg. I have no idea why, but they went to Hamburg, except for one possibility. They were able to pay a smuggler to get on a ship and were waiting for that to happen when unfortunately they were captured by the Nazis first and transported via transport V1-2 from Hamburg to Theresienstadt on July 19th, 1942. This date was only 2 months prior to when my mother made her way out of Berlin. Max was eventually moved again, this time to Auschwitz on September 28th. I still have no idea what he did in Theresienstadt for 2 years, but most likely he worked in one of the German manufacturing plants that utilized the slave laborers. His kids, Erica and Rita, ended up in Auschwitz. Erica was 16, Rita was 20. I don't know anything more about how they died. My grandfather had one more sibling named Marguerite, or Meta for short. Meta had married a gentleman named Bernhard, and they had two sons, Heinz and Kurt. Meta and Bernhard both ended up in Auschwitz and perished there. Kurt was taken away to Theresienstadt, moved to Auschwitz, and finally moved to Buchenwald, which was the largest concentration camp within the pre-war German borders. He was one of many that were tattooed with numbers twice. He had two numbers on his arm. But that did nothing to protect him from disease and starvation. And he died right after being liberated by the American 6th Army Division in April of 1945. His brother Heinz ended up in a Berlin orphanage. I'm off one slide, sorry. Sorry about that. His brother Heinz ended up in a Berlin orphanage and eventually was rescued by the Kindertransport program. You may have heard of that. The Kindertransport rescue program originated only 5 days after Kristallnacht, when a delegation went personally to the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, pleading with him to relax some immigration laws that would allow unaccompanied Jewish children admittance into the United Kingdom. Within a week, the British Parliament debated the bill and passed it into law. And only a couple days later, on November 25th, the British citizens heard a radio broadcast pleading for the rescue of children out of Germany and into the safety of the UK. A British citizen by the name of Dr. Wittner. I don't know what kind of doctor, his first name or his background, but I do know that he sent money to the Berlin orphanage in order to sponsor Heinz to make his way to London, along with thousands of others. Heinz made it to London, age 15, and not able to speak any English. He was raised throughout his teenage years by Dr. Wittner, went to a good school, was a Boy Scout, and eventually married. He had 3 children. One of those children is Katja, and she's my second cousin. I had the pleasure of meeting her some 48 years ago. And once again, just last March in London, where Christina and I had a wonderful visit with her. She had many photos that we pored over, and one of them caught my interest. It was a photo of a group of boys in the aft of a ship. It turned out that Heinz had taken the photo with his Brownie camera that he had apparently been able to take it with him and always kept nearby. The ship was the SS Manhattan and had 88 German kids. It was the only ship that took kids on the Kristallnacht, on the kinder transport program. And I have a photograph of it. It's not on the internet or anything like that. It shows him sailing towards England. Heinz died in 1969 at the age of 45 and never spoke about his experiences as a refugee. The kinder transport project enabled some 10,000 unaccompanied children from areas like Germany, Austria, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. Upon the end of the war, a very large majority learned that their parents left behind ended up dead at the hands of the Nazis. Today, there are a few cities such as Berlin, London, and Gdansk, Poland, that have art installations in honor of memory of those affected by the kinder transport project. One quick trivia comment about the SS Manhattan. The ship was used to bring the US Olympic team to Germany for the 1936 Olympics, the very one at which Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals and embarrassed Hitler in his home stadium. I found this photo of Jesse Owens practicing the long jump on the forward of the same ship, the SS Manhattan, the same spot that the kinder transport kids were standing in the photo that I have. That was kind of interesting. So far, I've only touched on my mother's side. As I mentioned, there are other stories of those that perished in the camps besides those that were displaced and survived the war. I do not think there's anyone else that ended up in the camps and survived. My father's side is much shorter, and it won't take me very long to tell you a few stories. My father, Arnold, as I mentioned, was born in 1924 in Berlin. His father served in the German army and was decorated by the Iron Cross. We went over all. His last place of service was in a town of Brest-Litovsk, which was the site of the peace treaty signing between the Bolshevik government of Russia and the Central Powers. The treaty was later annulled after the armistice of November 11th, 1918. I found this photo of Brest-Litovsk with my grandfather in the foreground. It's dated November 26, 1918, 15 days after the armistice. I have no idea why he was still there. What I found more interesting is that he wrote Blaue Kirche. Let's see if I have my goal. Right there. It says Blaue Kirche, which means blue church. And I did some internet sleuthing on to see why he wrote down blue church. And now you can see why, because that's what it looks like today. It's still there today. That was kind of interesting. My grandfather had a couple brothers, and one didn't do too well in World War I as he became injured in the Western Front in France and died in a field hospital in October 1918, only 2 weeks before the end of the war. Another brother was injured and needed an arm amputated. He became a highly respected Berlin lawyer and passed away prior to the Second War. For the most part, the Zweig family was thriving and enjoying life in Germany. My grandfather had work, and the family was able to have a nanny, as well as taking frequent trips in the surrounding European countries. Things were good until anti-Semitism started in full force. As with my mother's experience, signs were everywhere, like this one that reads, "Jews, your time is over. You have to get out of Germany." Or with this one that reads, "We don't want to see Jews. They're our problem." And finally, Germans, don't buy from Jews. At what point does a family consider leaving and going to a place that's safer? A large number of Jewish families saw all the signs and quickly decided to pack up and leave, generally to any country that would issue a visa to them, and that list grew shorter by the day. My brother and my grandparents were finally able to acquire some sort of visa to leave the country. I have that here in my folder. Someone wants to look at it later. And they were able to leave the country and enter the country of Colombia. From what I heard and see, the legality of the visa was somewhat fishy. It was most likely done through a bribe. The certificate was issued by the Consul of Colombia within the city of Frankfurt, Germany. Erna, my grandmother, had traveled there from Berlin based on information that the Consul of Colombia in Frankfurt was still issuing these visas despite orders and suggestions from the Colombian government not to do so. The consul, Ernesto Langenbach, was a German citizen and was not following instructions from the Colombian government. This enabled the Zweig family to leave Berlin on September 24th, 1938, just 16 days after the notice. Only one day before, on September 23rd, the Colombian government issued Decree 1723 to put an end to further issuing of visas. So they missed it by like a day, or they made it by a day. When my grandparents told my father and brother that they were going to Colombia, they were pretty happy, but they had no idea where Colombia was, and they had to open up an encyclopedia to see where it was. So off they went. They went on the SS Colombie from Berlin to Le Havre, France, and then off to Cartagena, Colombia. And that's my dad with my uncle there. My father's grandmother, Minna, decided to stay behind. She was one day short of her 77th birthday when she was taken by the Nazis out of Berlin on July 27, 1942. She had lived alone in an apartment in the middle of the city, right in the outskirts of the famous Tiergarten Park. She was elderly and most likely having a hard time getting around and filling her meager food rations. Perhaps she had neighbors that watched over her, or an old friend that would share some crusty bread or some soup. We'll never know all the details that surround her last 3 days. What we do know is that the elderly Jewish people were considered useless to the Nazis. Elderly Jewish Germans like my great-grandma were not strong enough to take the slave labor positions like so many German companies instituted. The factories and shops that fueled the German war effort were well known for this and ultimately ended up paying a lot of money to families in the future. Many of the concentration camps had large wrought iron signs outside the entrance gates that read Arbeit macht frei, or work brings freedom, which attempted to appease the fears of incoming prisoners. They wanted the prisoners to have a false perception that hard work and obedience in these camps would ultimately lead to their release. I always wonder if that's what my grandfather felt when he sent that note to his family. I wonder if these people thought that as well. Or perhaps a few of these 100 people did also feel that. We'll never know. My great-grandma Minna was taken to Theresienstadt when the Nazis deported her on the Alters transport, the Old People's Transport, with 99 others. Only 3 survived that initial intake. Theresienstadt was located in the German-controlled country of Czechoslovakia in an old town. I'm sorry, that shows her, my great-grandma being transported. Sorry. So Theresienstadt was located in the German-controlled country of Czechoslovakia in a town called Terezin. History shows that the Holy Roman Emperor from 1765 to 1790, Joseph II, ordered the construction of a fort to prevent Russian troops from invading. The fort was named Theresienstadt in honor of his mother, Maria Theresa. One bit of irony about Joseph II is that he abolished the death penalty and serfdom, a complete contrast to what Theresienstadt would become years later. Another note about Joseph II, he was the brother of Marie Antoinette and tried to get her to escape to France during the French Revolution. When Minna arrived at the camp, she was one of 32,878 Jewish residents of Germany that were deported there in 1942. Of those, the first deportees from Berlin only started arriving to Theresienstadt 1 month earlier than Minna. She was not tattooed, but assigned a number 2387. Minna was she was assigned to the barracks that housed the elderly Jewish females. The elderly barracks have been described as being like a dark dungeon with only a single light bulb and little to no heating. They were on the 3rd floor of the barracks, like an attic. The floors were not smooth concrete, but irregular with wood jutting out, just waiting for some suspecting elderly person to trip up. The room had rafters open to the exterior, allowing the hot sun and ice-cold winter to enter. The situation in the camp had been dire, even before Minna arrived, with children and adults dying daily, often with 50 elderly dying in a single day. In August 1942, the camp had become extremely crowded with the stench of dead and sick people, often filling the cramped rooms. The dead were left in their rooms and barracks for a full day in the heat until they were carried out. Thousands of food often consisted of moldy bread or a thin gray lentil soup. Thousands were transported out of the camp to their death at places like Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen, just to make room for the ongoing transports. At the beginning of 1943, when Minna was there for only 6 months, the notorious Adolf Eichmann found the Theresienstadt ghetto to be too crowded and decided to send increasing numbers of transport directly to Auschwitz. Included in this edict was the inclusion of young children that previously had been immune to the deportation transports. These transports commenced on January 20th, 1943, and 4 days later, Minna had died. She did not die in a gas chamber or by some bizarre medical experiment, but according to the camp death certificate, she died from heart failure. It's entirely possible that she died from starvation or from seeing the kids being taken away, but we'll never know. My parents ended up meeting in Colombia after my grandmother and mom immigrated there as well. Excuse me. They immigrated there in 1949. My father and his family had already been there, and they both met through mutual family members that had known each other in pre-war Berlin. They married in 1955 and moved to California in 1957 with my 1-year-old sister living in Los Angeles. She's got her Mickey Mouse here. I think Disneyland was only open for like 1 or 2 years at that point. They both became naturalized citizens and enjoyed living in California until their recent passing, only 8 months apart. Many have asked me, how did you find out all this information? Where do you get all this stuff? At the end of World War II, many records were destroyed prior to the Allies getting their hands on them. Likewise, a very large amount of records were kept and eventually preserved by the Russians in Moscow. Unfortunately, getting the records out of the Soviet Union became a huge issue for historians and documentarians. With the eventual fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, these records became increasingly available, digitized, and placed on numerous online research areas. Some of these, such as myheritage.com and ancestry.com, have made genealogy relatively easy. It used to be that one had to travel to the large genealogy research center in Salt Lake City or the National Archives in DC and pour over a microfilm looking for clues. Now it's easy. Go online to an online data source with some basic information about a relative, anything from a birth date, their address, names of other relatives. It's possible to find out quite a bit with just a few clicks on a keyboard. The Arlsen Archives, based out of Bad Arlsen, Germany, is the largest such data source, including some 30 million original documents and information on some 17.5 million people, and it's growing on a daily basis. The information I received about the Brussels detention camps was found on the Kazerne Docine Memorial Site and Research Center located in Belgium. It's also an incredibly well-done museum. If you're ever in Brussels, go to this museum. They have an annual portrait ceremony during which portraits of Holocaust victims who were deported from Mechelen are added to a commemoration wall. Every year, they add more and more photos. Currently, 4 out of 5 victims that are deported via the Docine barracks have been given a face. Let's go here. Here's part of the wall that shows 28,000 faces. And you notice some of those faces just have a silhouette. Those are the ones which they do not have the photos. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has a very nice online database as well, with some great educational materials for younger people. Other sources gathered were from the Centrum Judaicum Foundation in Berlin, the UK National Archives, the National Archives of the Czech Republic, and the State Museum of Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland. All these facilities have dedicated staff that go over and above any request and question that one may have about their relatives. One more center, which I just skipped over, sorry. The Yad Vashem Museum in Israel is an absolute must-see for anyone visiting the area. I've been there a few times and find it to be an essential spot to help understand what the Holocaust means to so many people. Their online database is also extremely helpful in research for looking up family members. So thank you for listening. If anyone has any question, I'll try my best to answer them.